Everyone in the small town of Darlington whispered about the hospital that sat rotting at the end of Willow Street, a hulking structure of cracked windows and collapsing walls where the sick once came in search of hope and often found only death. And though children dared each other to step inside its shadowed corridors, no one stayed long because there were stories of voices that still cried in the night and shadows that seemed to move when no one was near. But none of those stories ever stopped 22-year-old medical student James Parker when he decided he would go in and spend the night, determined to prove to himself and to his skeptical friends that ghosts were nothing but tales spun by fearful people with wild imaginations. James had always been obsessed with the human mind, with what fear could do, and he thought he could use this place as an experiment. But when he arrived just before midnight, carrying only a flashlight and a small backpack, he noticed something that made him pause, a faint flicker of light in a window on the third floor where there should have been nothing but darkness. And though his rational brain told him it was probably a reflection or a trick of his tired eyes, his heart beat harder as he pushed open the heavy front doors that groaned like they hadn't been touched in years. The smell hit him first, a mixture of mold, dampness, and something coppery that reminded him of dried blood. And as his flashlight beam swept across peeling paint and rusted gurneys, he felt an odd heaviness settle over his shoulders like the building itself was watching him. He walked through the main lobby where faded signs still hung above broken reception desks, and the silence pressed against his ears so thickly that every crunch of glass beneath his shoes seemed to echo down the hallways like a scream. But he told himself to breathe and keep going. He decided to head for the third floor, the place where he had seen that flicker of light. Climbing a stairwell lined with graffiti and strange symbols he couldn't quite understand, and with each step he felt colder as if the air itself had dropped 10 degrees. When he reached the third floor, his flashlight illuminated rows of patient rooms, each door hanging open like a mouth inviting him inside. And though part of him wanted to leave, his stubbornness pushed him forward until he found himself standing before room 313, a door that, unlike the others, was almost completely shut except for a narrow crack of darkness. He pushed it open slowly and the smell of rot grew stronger, and in the center of the room sat a hospital bed with sheets yellowed and stiff. And on the bed lay what looked like a shape under the covers, small and still, and James froze because no one should have been there. His light trembled in his hand as he stepped closer, and with each step the shape beneath the sheet seemed more defined until it was clear it was a human body lying perfectly still. But when he reached out to pull the sheet back, the shape beneath it vanished, collapsing into nothing but air, leaving the bed bare, and his chest tightened in confusion and terror. He whispered to himself that it was fatigue or his eyes playing tricks, but then the overhead light in the hallway flickered once and went out, plunging him into near darkness except for his flashlight beam. And from somewhere down the hall came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. James called out nervously, asking if someone was there, trying to sound calm, but the steps stopped suddenly, replaced by the faint creak of wheels. And when he aimed his light toward the sound, he saw an old wheelchair rolling by itself across the hall before coming to a stop just outside room 313, as if waiting for him. His throat went dry and he felt his grip tighten around the flashlight as he forced himself to step back into the hallway. And the moment his foot touched the floor outside the room, he heard a voice, soft and raspy, whispering his name, James, from the wheelchair. He spun around, the beam of light catching the cracked leather seat, and for a split second he saw the faint outline of a woman sitting there, her face pale and hollow with dark eyes that seemed to stretch endlessly before she vanished into the shadows. James stumbled backward, his chest heaving, and though every instinct screamed at him to run, he pushed himself forward, desperate to understand what he had seen. And the wheelchair began to roll ahead of him slowly down the corridor, turning left at the end as if leading him somewhere. Against all logic he followed, his breath clouding in the cold air, until he reached the end of the hall where the chair had stopped outside another door, this one marked with a faded sign that read Isolation Ward. The door creaked open as he approached, revealing a long room lined with broken beds and glass partitions, and at the very end he saw a single bed with straps still hanging from its sides. And lying there was a figure, this time not vanishing, Not collapsing, but a man, skeletal and gaunt, wearing a tattered hospital gown, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. James whispered a startled question, asking if he was all right, and the figure turned its head slowly, revealing a face stretched thin over bone, eyes clouded but piercing, and in a voice that rattled like dry leaves he said, "I am the last patient." James froze, his skin crawling as the man began to sit up, the straps falling away as though they had never been fastened, and the air in the room grew heavier, pressing against James's lungs, making it hard to breathe. The patient swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, impossibly tall, his shadow stretching across the entire room, and he stepped toward James with movements that were too smooth, too deliberate, as if the air itself bent around him. James tried to back away, but his legs felt locked, his body refusing to obey, and the patient leaned close, his breath icy on James's face, whispering that the hospital never closed, that the patients never left, that he had been waiting for someone new. The lights overhead flickered violently and shattered, plunging the room into darkness except for James's failing flashlight, and in the beam he saw dozens of shapes rising from the beds, figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces, all moving toward him, their footsteps echoing like thunder. His scream tore from his throat as he turned and ran, crashing through the door and down the hallway, the sound of pursuit growing louder, closer, until he stumbled into the stairwell and nearly fell headfirst down the steps, catching himself just in time, racing toward the lobby with terror clawing at his back. The front doors loomed ahead, wide and heavy, and he slammed against them with all his strength, bursting into the night air. But when he looked back, the hospital was dark and silent again. No footsteps, no voices, nothing but the broken building staring at him. He staggered home, his body trembling, and told himself he had imagined it all, that it was just fear and exhaustion. But that night, as he lay in his bed trying to sleep, he heard it again, the slow squeak of a wheelchair rolling across his room, and from the corner of the darkness a raspy voice whispered, "Welcome back, James. You are now our last patient." James jolted upright in his bed, his heart hammering so violently he thought it might burst, and he told himself over and over that he was awake, that this was his apartment and not that cursed hospital. But the sound of the wheelchair wheels dragging slowly across the floor was real, scraping against the wooden boards with each agonizing inch. And when he dared to glance toward the corner, he saw it again, the cracked leather seat, the rusted frame, and sitting inside it the faint outline of the hollow-faced woman he had seen in the hospital hallway, her pale eyes locked onto his in the dim glow of the streetlight slipping through the blinds. He scrambled to the lamp on his bedside table, fumbling for the switch, and when the bulb flared to life, the chair was empty, but the smell of rot and disinfectant clung to the air, stronger than ever, and James pressed his hands to his face, whispering that he was losing his mind. Over the following days, he tried to bury himself in work and classes, telling no one what he had experienced, but sleep became his enemy because each night the hospital came for him, not in dreams but in waking terror, pulling him back into its rotting corridors the moment he closed his eyes, his body frozen while figures whispered from the shadows, their voices filling his skull with pleas and cries, begging him to stay with them. One evening he confided in his friend Melissa, a fellow medical student who had a sharp curiosity and a belief in things James had always dismissed. And though he spoke reluctantly, she listened with wide eyes and quiet horror. And when he finished, she told him something that made his blood run cold. Years ago, long before James was born, the hospital had been closed after a fire on the third floor killed nearly 24 patients who had been left strapped to their beds when the flames spread. And though officials claimed their bodies were buried in a mass grave on the outskirts of town, rumors said that the fire had not killed them all, that some patients had been hidden away in the isolation ward, where they lingered for days without food or water, their cries ignored until silence fell. Melissa told him the locals whispered about the last patient, a soul who refused to leave, and that whoever dared to disturb the hospital would be claimed as the new final patient, taking his place among the restless dead. James wanted to laugh, to brush it away, but the memory of the man rising from the bed, the words, "You are our last patient," clung to his chest like chains, and he realized with sickening dread that Melissa's story fit perfectly with what he had seen. Determined to end it, James returned to the hospital with Melissa by his side, carrying candles, salt, and an old book of rituals Melissa had borrowed from her grandmother, a woman steeped in folk traditions. They entered through the broken doors just after midnight, the air colder than before, the silence suffocating, and though James wanted to turn back, Melissa urged him forward, her face pale but resolute. They followed the path James had taken days earlier, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and when they reached the third floor, the faint flicker of light appeared again in room 313, waiting like a beacon. Together they stepped inside, the bed once again holding the impression of a body beneath the sheet, and Melissa whispered a prayer as she drew a circle of salt on the floor, telling James to stay inside no matter what. The sheet on the bed began to rise slowly, filling with shape as if a body were forming beneath it, and a moan drifted through the air, low and guttural, vibrating the walls. The temperature plummeted, and the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into a choking darkness broken only by the wavering glow of their candles. From the shadows emerged the patient, taller and more grotesque than James remembered, his face a mask of agony stretched across sharp bones, his eyes pits of endless black, and behind him dozens of shapes appeared, the lost patients dragging themselves forward, their mouths open in silent screams. James clung to Melissa, but she stood firm, chanting words from the book, her voice shaking but steady, commanding the spirits to return to their rest. The figures writhed and hissed, their forms flickering in and out of sight, but the last patient stepped closer, ignoring the salt circle, his skeletal hand reaching toward James, and in that moment James realized the ritual was failing. He shouted at Melissa to stop, to run, but she pressed on, her voice rising as the patient's hand brushed against the edge of the salt, sizzling as though burned, and he recoiled with a roar that rattled the windows. The figures shrieked and lunged against an unseen barrier, clawing at the air, and Melissa screamed for James to add his voice to believe, to pour his fear into the words. Together they shouted the incantation, their voices trembling with desperation, and the room filled with blinding white light as the figures wailed in unison, collapsing into dust that swirled through the air before vanishing into nothingness. The last patient staggered backward, his form unraveling, his hollow eyes blazing with fury, and with a final guttural cry he dissolved into ash, leaving only silence behind. James collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat, and Melissa pulled him into a trembling embrace, whispering that it was over. They fled the hospital before dawn, leaving behind the stench of rot and the echo of forgotten screams, and for weeks afterward James slept peacefully for the first time in months, the wheelchair no longer appearing in his room. But one night, long after he had convinced himself it was truly finished, he awoke to a sound so faint he thought at first it was part of his dream, the squeak of wheels turning slowly across the floor. And when he turned toward the corner of his room, his breath caught in his throat because there it was again, the cracked leather seat, the rusted frame, and sitting in it the hollow-faced woman with eyes like endless pits, whispering softly, "Welcome home. James, the hospital never let you go."